So hello and welcome to the fourth talk in our webinar series on Dublin City's Water Heritage, an initiative of Dublin City Council's Heritage Office and the local authority Waters programme, LAWPRO. The Dublin's Water Heritage series is broad in scope and explores the archaeological, natural, cultural, social and historical and industrial importance of Dublin's water heritage. My name is Charles Duggan. I'm the Dublin City Heritage Officer, and it's my great pleasure to host this River Heritage Talk, which is the fifth in the series. Our speaker today is Dr. Aileen O'Carroll. Aileen is a sociologist who has written about working lives in Dublin in her books Working Time, Knowledge, Work and Post-Industrial Society, which was published in 2015, and the Dublin Docker, which was published in 2017. She is the policy manager at the Digital Repository of Ireland and manager at the Irish Quantitative Data Archive based in Maynooth University. She advises researchers on best practice in managing and archiving research projects. And Aileen's talk today is called Working on the Waterfront, the story of the Dublin Docker, which looks at Dublin as a port city, which owes much to the labourers who strove against a heavy-duty tide of imports and exports, a league of thousands who were hired on a day-to-day basis for generations, defining the bustle of Dublin city centre, a cornerstone of the urban industrial working class in Ireland. In this talk, Dr. Aileen O'Carroll will talk about the history of the dockers and their deep-woven connection to the city. Over to you, Aileen.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for inviting me. The talk I'm giving today is based on a book that was written by Don Bennett and myself on the Dublin Docker. The background to the book is that the work was commissioned by the Association of Dublin Stevedores, who approached UCD to both archive their business records and to produce a book capturing the lives and culture about Dublin dockers before it was too late to capture first-hand accounts. Don Bennett was both the project lead and later a regular attender of the meetings of the Dublin Dock Workers Preservation Society, which he enjoyed enormously until his death in 2014. One of his emails to me went, "Topic, thrilling. Pretty thrilling to spend some time talking to the old-time dockers last night." I think when we both were engaged in this research, it was the stories and lives of the dock workers that inspired us, and I hope to share some of their stories tonight. The Dublin Dock Workers Preservation Society began their work in 2011. They were made up of retired dock workers, checkers, and other port workers and supporters. Their goal was to preserve the industrial heritage of Dublin docks and the rich history of dockland communities. In their first 2 years, they collected approximately 3,000 photographs and almost 1,000 documents. They've now deposited their collection with the Dublin City Archive, and you can also see them on their online website. I really encourage you all to go to. Here we have a snapshot from their collection. It's black and white. It's quite poor quality. It's very grainy. It's just a snapshot of 5 men standing against a wall. They're all wearing caps, 2 of them in their suits jackets. The rest are in heavy coats. We don't know where or when it was taken or on what occasion, but we do know who most of the men were, thanks to the work of the Dublin Dock Workers Preservation Society. We know they worked as deep sea dockers. So who were the deep sea dockers? In Dublin, the docking story begins with the story of the hobbler, and the story of the hobbler begins with the story of Dublin Port. If we look at the 1911 census, we find 2 people who gave their occupation as hobbler. There was a Thomas O'Toole, who lived on St. Rogerson's Quay, South Dock, and John Nolan, who lived on Hanover Street East, South Dock. As Dublin grew as a port town, the port faced 2 problems. Firstly, the silting of the Liffey made discharge at the quayside difficult, as ships could not negotiate the shallow channel. They couldn't get up far enough. And secondly, as you can see in this picture here, You had congestion of the berths, adding to the problem. So boats would have to queue 2 or 3 deep to be unloaded. And that took time and money. And into that space came the hobbler. So who was the hobbler? The hobbler was a docker or a fisherman who rowed out to ships in the bay to unload or negotiate for unloading. As an aside, the problem of the silting of the bay was finally solved in the 1840s by the Bull Wall, which was built or overseen by Captain Bligh of Mutiny of the Bligh fame. So 4 or 5 men in shallow hull boats called lighters would row out and throw a hook onto the ship's side. The first person to get to the ship got the job. If you think about it, you had a very small shallow boat, a very large cargo boat from which you had to unload cargo. Both boats are moving with the waves. There's a great danger of tilting, getting crushed against the boat, or by moving cargo. It was an extremely dangerous occupation. It persisted until it was formally prohibited by the Port and Docks Board in 1936. This was following a tragedy in which a Dunleary skip known as Jealous of Me floundered in the bay in December 1934, drowning 3 young hobblers, Richard and Henry Shortall and John Hughes. So why do we call dockers dockers? In the US, they use the term longshoreman or wharfie, which is a phrase similar to what you find commonly used in the 1911 census of key labor. In other countries, the word stevedore is used interchangeably with dockers, and the term originates in a Spanish word where it means literally a packer of cargo. In the Irish context, stevedore has a different meaning. In Ireland, the stevedore is the middleman who hires the labor and negotiates with the ship owner. So just as the hobbler got the contract to unload the ship at sea, the stevedore, when the hobbler moved to the port, got the job to hire the work at the port. Over time, he referred to himself as Master Stevedore, and then it became stevedore. A few dockers continued in the hobbler tradition to work multiple trades. Boatmen were those who tied up ships with huge ropes to the moorings, and some dockers would double as boatmen. Just a quick mention about this photo. You can see the custom house, and you can see sailing ships moored alongside it. In front of the sailing ship, you see a crane that was used to unload goods from the ship. The custom house was important because that is where the dockers used to wait, sitting on the steps to see what ships would be docked and trying to work out where they might best get work. Okay, so I'm going to move to how they got work. So this is a picture of what's called as the shape up in the US, or in Canada, it was called the shape up. In the UK, it was called the call. In Ireland, it was called the reed. So under the casualization period, which was really the majority of the period dockers were working, dockers were hired and paid on a daily basis. They had no guaranteed job, no guaranteed income. First, you had to get your work, which involved going down to the port and trying to find out which boats had arrived and who was likely to be hiring, what reeds were likely to be looking for men, and where you could best head offer. It was very competitive. When I was doing the research, I often wondered how many people were working on the docks, and you would think that is an easy question to answer, but it actually proved to be quite difficult because obviously, as variable labor, there was no list of workers held, by one particular ship owner that he could say he employed. The people employed varied day by day. We can get a bit of a sense of how many were employed by looking at strike reports in the newspapers. So in 1922, it was reported that 5,000 dock workers were affected by a strike in Dublin port. If we rush forward over 40 years, the Dublin port, a report in Dublin port said that there was 2,000 dockers working on the docks. By 1973, that had dropped again to 750. In 1992, you had 42 permanent dockers with 100 on a part-time register. So you can see that over time, the numbers employed on the docks declined. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. This is the only picture we have of the Reed that we've been able to find. And it's unfortunately of very poor quality. It's possibly a photocopy of a newspaper. Thanks again to the Dublin Dockworkers Preservation Society, we know who the people are in this picture. The man on the left is Jack Gideon. The man next to him could be Paddy Grimes. They were foremen working for Palgrave Murphy. Palgrave Murphy was a shipping company formed in 1830. And after the Second World War, they set up as a stevedoring company. That's a company who would hire dockers and then get contracts from the ship to unload the ships. In this picture, it's likely there's actually two Reeds going on at the same time, because if you look very closely at the men in the phone box, you see they're looking to the right at another stand. A docker told me that this could have been Patsy Kelly for Irish Shipping, and the stand would have been possibly George Bell's stand. At the time, there was about 4 or 5 Reeds occurring at the same time. You had a Reed for Dublin Maritime, Conway Shipping. You had Reeds for slag boats. Carrick Stevedore would try and hire dockers to unload timber and sleepers, cement and ammunition boats. Willie Byrne would try and hire dockers to unload coal boats. Willie and Jerry Nolan would be hiring dockers for the fossil boats. Fossil boats meant loose bulk cargo of phosphates and potash. These were shoveled out of the hold by deep sea dockers. Kit Murphy and Pullen would be hiring for the bottle house ships, which was sand and soda ash. The Reed system was widely disliked. Somebody said to me, anybody who was a friend of the corpse might get a job. Before 1946, it was a tradition often to try and bribe your way into work. The story went that you would buy the stevedore a whiskey when he paid you for the work done. Often you get paid in pubs at the end of the day, and this was a practice that Larkin argued against. So as the stevedore gave you his pay, you would give him a glass of whiskey. And then at the end of paying all the dockers, he would perhaps have 20 glasses of whiskey, which he then would give back to the publican, who would pour it back in the bottle, and the publican would give him the price of a bottle of whiskey. So in a way, it was a way of bribing for work and keeping yourself in with the stevedore. There was improvements over time via union organization and often industrial action. One of the biggest changes happened in 1946. This was after the Second World War, when there was a huge increase in shipping, in particularly because Liberty ships, as they were known, from the US were coming in to Dublin port. So in 1946, when there was a great demand for port labor, 500 cross-channel dockers went on strike for a fortnight annual holiday with pay, something we all are lucky to enjoy these days. They won the 9 days paid holidays, but they also won something else. They also won the introduction of a button register. This was a voluntary register, and under this system, the button system, button men, that's men who owned the button, were given first preference when jobs were being distributed. Buttons were given to people who were dockers of long standing with the tradition of dockers and union members. So the work was still casual. There was no guarantee of job or income. You still had to turn up. But if you were from a traditional docking family and you had the button, you always knew you had to be picked before anybody else who came down. And other people did come down. I heard stories of builders coming down during August when the building site shut down, of Trinity students who had come down during the summer looking for some part-time work, of teachers coming down again, trying to make extra work. So with the button system, people who had been traditionally and for long, from father to son working in docks had a very slight advantage over other people. A number of buttons were given out over time. The blue, the red was distributed in 1950s to the sons of dockers. Seamen were often also offered the opportunity to get a button, and to become dockers, they could opt into the system because they were an allied occupation. And there was also often very close bonds or connection between people working as seamen and people working as dockers. In fact, I interviewed one seaman who was from a family of seamen who, unfortunately, when he went to sea, discovered he suffered extremely bad seasickness. So it wasn't the job for him, and he switched to being a docker instead. So this is a picture from the Irish Photographic Archive, and they have a number of pictures which focus on beautiful photographs which show dockers in their work. They're unusual pictures also because they're all pictures of dockers exporting, loading onto Irish goods onto ships. And really, in reality, most of the work on dockers done by dockers was to do with the unloading of ships, as Dublin port imported far more than it exported. So if you think of Ireland as an island and you think of Dublin as a port, and think of the sort of commodities that would come into the port and indeed still do. So this is a picture of bales of hay in the ship hold. You would grain to make bread. That was dusty. The grain would be full of pollen. It irritated the skin. You had tea. You had sugar boats coming from Cuba. They would be 8 or 10 stone bags of sugar, raw brown sugar. 2 men would attach them to a rope and lift them off the boat. You had bales of paper, wood pulp for making paper bags. You had bags of commodities, cocoa beans, fish meal, groundnuts, flour, fruit, onions, apples, bananas. I found a newspaper article about the first apples and bananas back in Dublin port after the war. For the building trade, you had bags of cement, 8 stone bags carried on backs, bags of calcium, timber, bricks, slates. Copper ore in particular was very heavy. It would come loose and had to be shoveled using a very small shovel because it was such a heavy product, the number 5 shovel. You also had fertilizer in the form of guana, i.e. bird droppings, which was a very unpopular commodity to have to work with. And you also had coal used to heat the houses of Dublin. Coal work was very dirty work. The docker's skin would be thick with coal dust, as with their clothes. It was hard physical labor. They would use a number 7 shovel. Here's a picture of the number 7 shovel. The number 7 shovel itself weighed 12 pounds, that's 5 kilograms. And the coalies would shovel up to 4 stone of coal, that's 25 kilograms. So just think about a day's work where you're shoveling 25 kilograms of coal using a 5 kilogram shovel. The ships were worked by gangs, and this is something that sets dock work out from almost all type of work at the time, in that the gangs were fairly autonomous. They distributed the work they had to do themselves. They had control over how fast or how slow they would work. Different people in the gang specialized in different jobs. So this is a picture of a coal ship. You had 16 men in the hold at one time, 4 tubs of coal, 4 men to a tub. It was divided into outside work and inside work. Inside work, as you can imagine, was the hardest because you're going down into the hold, filling the buckets, which then have to be lifted off the boat using the crane. Gang got smaller over the time. Early days, you could have 21 in a gang. Once you had more technology like cranes, winches, forklift trucks, you could have dropped to 6. So initially men carried bags off the ships on their backs, walking along gangpipes. Then you would have a winch on the quay or on the ship that would lift the bags off, which meant less men needed to unload the ship. In the ship, there was very different types of workers. You had the bushlers. The bushlers worked in pairs, transferring the vast heap of grain in which they stood into sacks. One man held a sack while another filled it and attached it to an overhanging hook. The winchman controlled the ship's winch. This was a very a job that you needed somebody with skill, because obviously you're carrying heavy loads and you don't want to drop them on the dockers or injure anybody in moving them. So it was tends to be given to people with skill and experience. The winchman sometimes earned extra money because of the skill he needed to do this job. He was often working blind. He wouldn't be able to see the men in the hold. And because of that, you had another job called the singer-outer. The singer-outer's job was to signal when the load was ready to be hoisted and check the quality of the hoist. The bearer-off would ensure that the hoist of sacks would be kept clear of the sides and the hatchway wouldn't get stuck. On the dock side, you had the guy hauler. The guy hauler was a specialist docker whose role involved manipulation of the ship's derricks, the ship's lifting device. The derrick was pulled around by a hand using a wire. This was necessary in order to position the derrick for maximum reach. So when he wasn't doing that, he could be employed moving stacks and other commodities on the deck for the weighman. The checker off would count what came off the boat to make sure everything was in the ship that arrived in the ship arrived into the warehouse. They'd also check how much was being unloaded, because after a certain point, dockers were entitled to additional pay. This is a picture of some elephants. So I was told from Dublin Port, I found this. I think the Dublin Dockworkers Preservation Society found this, and it comes with a story. The story was that there was one checker who was constantly reporting that the dockers had unloaded just under the amount that would give them extra pay. And this obviously led to great frustration. So on one day, 2 elephants were being unloaded from the ship. And the story goes that as they were being unloaded, the dockers distracted the checker so he didn't see the elephant get to land. At the end of the day, when they looked at his tally, they disputed it, as usual. But this time they could say, "You didn't even count the elephants," implying that he didn't do his job correctly. So outside the ship, you had the hooker on, who hooked the hook on the dockside crane, detaching the ship's winch and raising from the hoist to the hold. You had tippers who would tip loose bulk cargo into the waiting lorries or the carts. You had people who stacked the cargo in the sheds. And then you had spellers, people who stepped in to give the dockers a break. Often they were the sons of dockers who'd come back down to the port for a day. This is just another strange story I came across in the course of doing this research. This is about a lion that was imported for a circus and was being prepared for delivery at the North Wall, Dublin, when it clawed Mr. Coughlin, and another man was forced to hit the lion with an iron bar, forcing the animal to release the hold. So as I said, all sorts came into the dock lands. So this is a picture of the Carrick House gang. This is a typical, this is one of the gangs that worked on the docks. This is known as a house gang. A house gang saw themselves as the top dockers. They were the ones who got regular work. They were picked by the stevedores because they were dependable, they were skilled, they worked faster. They were also relations and brothers and uncles and nephews and cousins. So in terms of getting picked in the reed, it helped if you could be born into or perhaps marry into an established docker's family. So Carrick was both a stevedore and also the surname of a lot of dockers that Carrick hired. And you can see that there's a number of Carricks on this picture. Another way you could get hired is by depending on the solidarity of other dockers. I found this story by Des Brannigan, who's a trade unionist and labour historian. And he talked about his work and a docker leader. And he talked about his work as a docker. And he said, you were picked to go on a particular ship, usually 2 or 3 days work. And after that, you were unemployed again. It was a very casual type of job. But the stevedores got at it. And they used to leave me standing there And the reason they left him standing there is because he's a well-known trade unionist, communist, and agitator. So he said, they used to leave me standing there until a very decent element among the dockers supported me. They put it bluntly, if he doesn't work, nobody else is going to work. No subtlety about it whatever, and that prevailed. And if that wasn't possible, you could possibly try and get associated with gangs who worked a particular cargo. So this is a picture of the timber gang. And this is another picture of a first gang. This is one of the top gangs, first gang, the gang who would always be picked first because they were related or because they had a reputation of getting the job done. I'm going to move on now and show you some of the tools that they worked with. One of the tools essential were the hooks. The dockers wore a leather belt, and in the belt they would carry different types of hooks. This is a J-shaped hooks. The hooks were made in England, so the docker would get a tailor friend to buy the hooks for him. This is a picture of a number of hooks. Another one is a bag hook. There's one here at the top, in the top third. It's a head with studded with tack ends, and it's used to handle bales of cotton, bagged animal feed, potatoes, or anything else in stacks. And actually, when I was on holiday at San Francisco in a coffee shop, I saw a bag hook on the table beside all the bags of coffee. So they were obviously, I don't know if they were using it, but it would have been used to handle sacks of coffee. I mentioned the Liberty ships earlier. In April 1947, the dockers were unloading anything up to 5,000 sacks from New York, which was an American gift to the Irish people during post-war hardship times. And to unload those sacks, they would be using bag hooks. Before I finish, I want to talk a little bit about the other people who were part of the dockland community, and that's the women and the children. I interviewed a woman called Phyllis Nolan, whose husband and father were dockers. And she talks when I talked in her interview about getting the ferry across the river to Alexandra Basin with a note in a pocket for her teacher explaining why she was going to be late for school, with her dinner for her father, sitting down beside him as he ate sausages, rashers, and fried bread kept warm in a can. Before marriage, most of the women and girls worked in factories and trades around the port. So you have women working in the watch factory and as biscuit packers. You have, in the census, you have women who are described their work as book folding, book binding, a sack maker. Most of the common occupations of dockers' wives and daughters in the 1911 census were as general domestic servants, housemaids, or housekeepers. Unusually, I did find one woman, a Mary Plunkett, who gave her occupation as ship winch driver, age 26. She was a visitor to Hanover Street East on the night of the census, and also perhaps that rarest of things, a female dock worker. In Ringsend, the boatyards, young women would be working, making sails and nets, fixing. And of course, to the women was faced the mental workload of budgeting on a household budget that varied. There was no set income for dockers. And to do that, often they relied very greatly on moneylenders. Phyllis Nolan told me the story about how she was widowed at 37 with 9 children. The moneylender arrived at the door. She answered the door and she said, "I know who you are and I know why you are." And he asked for her husband who had died. And Phyllis Nolan said, "If you get a number 7 shovel, you can go down to Dean's Grange Cemetery and dig him up." Terrified as she was, she stood her ground and he left. Because the docking work was difficult, there was often a high level of injuries, and with both people being injured very young or having to leave the occupation early because of injury. And there was a strong tradition of voluntary organizations among dock workers. And we see that in the union work that they did, but also in their mutual aid for each other. The voluntary organizations arranged picnics for orphans, dinner dances. There was a social club for retired dockers. They were involved in the erection of the Réalt na Mara statue on Bull Wall, which is still there. You can see it today. The trouble with the docks that, and a docker said to me, if something went wrong, it was serious. So docker community would step in to raise money to cover loss of pay or funeral expenses, or to help a widow until a widow's pension came through. At the time, there was no sick pay. So instead, you had collections for injured dockers. There was a magazine produced in the 1960s called the Waterfront. And they were not just a magazine, but they were also a mutual aid fund. And I think it's quite remarkable because they employed 3 doctors, introduced a sick and medical pay scheme for all port workers, men and women, introduced a Christmas savings scheme and children's scholarship schemes. Dock work changed in the 60s and 70s. Part of that change happened because the container was introduced, and the container just got rid of the need for dock workers. Instead, you had crane drivers who were lifting these boxes off the ships onto the coast now. So there was a debate all globally in all parts of the world between the ship owners who wanted to allow containers and the dockers who wanted to keep it out because it was going to impact on their livelihood. A negotiation in Dublin and in many ports resulted in the acceptance of a very high level of redundancy, and a lot of people leaving dock work. And so that's what the dockers lost. But what they gained was dock work became permanent, which this meant that dock workers were paid whether or not there was work available. This was called fallback money. It also got rid of the gang system. So instead of turning up at the reed and being appointed, being called by the stevedore by name when he wants to pick you, work was allocated alphabetically. And finally, I just want to, at the very end, just finish with one of the things that drew Don and I to the dock workers was their sense of humor. And you can see that humor in the wonderful use of nicknames and the turn of phrase of our interviews. So this is a list of some nicknames. Some of my favorites are jelly beans, biscuit, earrings, hearseman, a pint and a pillow, buckets of blood, saltbacks O'Connor, werewolf Freeman, Duckhead Kiernan, Granny Farrell, Two Thumbs Murphy. The nicknames were often a little bit, they could be a little bit, what's the word, taking the piss, ironic. So Buckets of Blood was not necessarily an aggressive person, as the name might imply. And the names were handy because the foreman would be calling out names, but you know, if you had dozens of people who were called Carrick, it was handy to be able to distinguish which Carrick in particular. Every name is a different story, and I think Don and I were both drawn to these stories and the way stories were told when we did research on the Dublin Dockers. And I hope that some of you will check out the book, which is available in Dublin City Libraries, and read more about this important legacy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aileen. That was a really fantastic journey into the life of the Dublin Docker. And it's quite interesting that you began the talk with the hobblers and how the particularly terrible conditions of Dublin Bay, which enabled this workforce to actually organize itself as a reaction to the difficulties of ships coming into the harbour. And I read recently that there was a particular group of hobblers in Ringsend, and the Ringsend hobblers. Have you come across those before?
Yeah, I mean, Ringsend has always had a very strong boating and tradition. So that's where you would have the crossover between the hobblers and the dockers. They had the boats, so they would be able to go out. And then, as I mentioned, also you would have the women who will be working, fixing the sails and the ships. So that brings end. And then also in Dún Laoghaire, further out, you would have had hobblers.
It must have been quite a dramatic thing, I guess, racing to the boats in order
yeah, in all weathers. I mean, when you think about those people who were sadly drowned, that was in December. That was Christmas Eve, I think. And so, you know, going out trying to catch a boat and then to unload it at sea in those conditions, it's hard to imagine what it would have been like.
And would they have used the 21 footers? Because I know they were made specifically in Ringsend, the boats. Those boat making was a big part of the traditions in Ringsend as well.
As far as I know, they were lighters, which is a very flat, and then and it's flat so that you can push, because you're taking the cargo in. It's not just men you're getting out to the boat, then you have to unload the boat at sea to put the cargo in and bring it back to the port.
And did the hobblers bring in passengers as well, or was it just cargo?
I don't know. I imagine it was probably just cargo. Yeah, I don't know though.
The other thing I thought was really interesting in your talk was this whole relationship between the stevedore and the docker and the boatman, and then with the rise of trade unions and the ITGW and others, that would have impacted presumably this relationship, and but then the enduring kind of role of the gangs. How did and you mentioned the antagonism between, if you were a union activist, that you were often not picked. Like, was that relationship quite fractious?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, and you mentioned earlier about the tides. So the strength of a docker was that it cost money for the shipping companies to wait at port. So they, once you're in the port, you have to unload, and then you want to be out on the next tide. So there's a time, you're under a very tight time frame. So if you're a docker unloading a ship and you think there's an opportunity to get extra money, you've got an awful big bargaining power. You can just down to tools and say, that's it. We're not going to go. It's dangerous. It's dirty. And often it's in the shipping companies or the stevedore's interest just to settle up with you and pass the cost on to somebody else. And that was one of the arguments in favor of containers, in that it got rid of all that chaos on the ships. So at a local level, there was quite closeness between the dockers and the trade unions, because often they were working together. Sometimes you would have dockers who would work in the trade union, then trade union docker. Internationally, that would happen. And up to if you read newspapers accounts in the 60s, the dockers had the ability that not a lot of workers do, of shutting down the economy, because if they shut down the port, then nothing could travel, nothing could move. So a lot of the trade union and employer negotiations at a higher level was about trying to ensure that these sort of informal shipside bargaining wouldn't happen, and instead you would have rules that could be followed. And there was huge numbers of rules that were developed over time that outlined what sort of work and when you could stop work and what sort of work was required, extra money, So there was a story of coal boats would sometimes go on fire, so and if you were in a ship, and that's dangerous work, it's extra money. So you could say it was, very hot, and then the chemist would come down with his thermometer and put it in to see how hot it was, and that would depend whether you get money. So there was an awful lot of continuous and ongoing negotiation on the ship, on the port side, which was advantageous to the dockers and irritating to the ship owners.
I can imagine. Well, listen, Aileen, thank you so much. It's been a fascinating journey through the history of the Dublin dockers. And I suppose one of the questions we're asking each of our speakers at the end of the talk is if you could recommend 3 resources or books for the public, what will they be?
Yeah, well, I have a couple of things I'd like to recommend. Well, firstly, I really suggest people just walk down by the quays in Dublin and walk down the south side and the north side. And now it's all tech companies and offshore banks. But try and imagine what it was like before. If you go down near where the Epic or the Jeannie Johnson is, that used to be a reed, or on the other side of the road at Cardiff Lane, that used to be where the reeds are. So try and imagine what it was like when it was full of men waiting for a job, or the guys up at the custom house with their bikes. If you had a bike, you had an advantage, because when you saw a boat get in, you might get to the reed first before somebody else. So that's my first suggestion. My second one is an app I love called Ship Tracker, which my interest in dockers has led to an interest in shipping in general. And if you get Ship Tracker, it'll show you every ship that's coming into Dublin Port, and you can track the ships and see where they leave and where they go to, how big they are, what port they live in. They normally where they're what's the word? I can't remember the word for where a ship is based. Anyway, and unfortunately, what you don't know is what's in the ships, and that is the real change. One of the real changes that I think has happened to the port now is, before, when things arrived in the port, the dockers knew what was there, and the kids around the docks would know what was there, and you would hear such and such has arrived. In fact, in the Irish Times, they used to have little reports saying what boats were in and what was going to be in them. You can look at ship trackers and you can track ships all over the world, but they don't tell you what commodities are in them. So in a way, that whole sense of how the world works is hidden from us. So Ship Tracker is great. And the third thing is, I'd love if people would go to the DRI website where I work, the Digital Repository of Ireland. That's www.dri.ie. And if you put in water into the DRI, you'll find some photographs from the 50s and 60s in Ireland, deposited by Fáilte Ireland, or you'll find surveyors' maps of Dublin from up to 1827, or you'll find some photographs from the Jacobs factory archive. So DRI is a digital online archive of humanities and social science stuff, and it's a real rich resource that it's fun to explore.
Absolutely, and in fact, DCC, Dublin City Council, Dublin City Library and Archives are depositing material there, as I understand it. So, and in fact, we have a load of material that we need to deposit there as well.
Its collections are growing all the time. Yeah.
Amazing site. It's an amazing site. Well, look, thank you so much, Aileen. It was absolutely brilliant, and for all those recommendations as well. We really, really appreciate it. And just to conclude the session, I would just like to draw the listeners' attention to some of the other talks that we have in the series. We have Rob Goodbody speaking about rivers and water bodies and industrial heritage. Professor Howard Clark is speaking about the lifeblood of medieval Dublin, the Liffey and its tributaries. We have Barry Keogh talking about the area between the Liffey and the Camach and the development of the suburb of Kilmainham. And we have Lara Joy, the Port Heritage Director, speaking about Dublin as a port city, looking at transport, trade and travel. And the archaeologist Antoine Giacometti is providing a really fascinating talk as well on the archaeology of Dublin's rivers, focusing primarily on the Liffey, but also looking at the Camach, the Dodder, and the very elusive Stein River as well. So thank you very, very much. And we hope everybody enjoys the series. And thank you again, Aileen, for a really terrific talk.
Thank you.